Before the doors opened, before the first bus dropped its cargo of restless teenagers onto the gravel lot, two staffers stood by the coffee urn in the Cutbank Grange Range Hall, watching an old man wheel a mop bucket down the firing line. "Why does the janitor carry a small brass key that fits nothing in the building?" one of them asked, not for the first time, and the other shrugged, because in 18 months neither of them had gotten a straight answer out of him. "He's harmless," said the first, a girl named Priya, who ran the sign-in table on weekends, quiet as a Sunday. The second, an older maintenance hire named Dwayne, shook his head slowly. "Harmless, sure. But you ever notice he's never once let anybody else touch those old Target carriages? Not Kira, not me, not the county inspector who came through in March. Man treats a scrap metal drum system like it's got a pulse. If you've ever watched someone carry a whole life's worth of skill in silence, you already know where this is going." Across the room, Kira Havermeyer stood at the whiteboard with a laminated checklist in one hand, briefing the morning's shooters on drill order, her voice pitched to carry to the back row of folding chairs, where the youngest of them slouched with their rifle cases across their knees. Somebody's radio crackled with weather data nobody needed yet. She was mid-sentence about crosswind flagging when a boy in the second row asked who served the old Target carriages, since his sight had drifted twice that week and nobody from the vendor had come out. "Oh, that's just the maintenance man," Kira said, not even glancing toward the door, her tone the flat, generous tone of someone brushing lint from a jacket. "He putters. Don't let him near the sighting rails. He'll throw off your zero worse than the wind will." The room laughed. The easy laugh of teenagers granted permission to laugh at an adult, and nobody noticed that Harmon Brackett was standing in the doorway with a mop in his hand, close enough to hear every word, because he had not made a sound coming in, and he did not make one going back out. He did not correct her. He never did. He finished the floor along the west wall in long, unhurried strokes, working the mop head around a bench leg with the same economy he brought to everything, and if the sentence had landed anywhere in him, it showed only in the extra half-second he spent wringing out the mop before starting the next row, as if the work itself required more attention than it had 5 minutes before. 78 years old, and not one soul in that hall could have told you what the letters would have spelled out beside his name, once, on a roster nobody kept anymore. Not one of them knew there was a reason the old carriages ran true only under his hands, or that the brass key riding in his coverall pocket had been machined on a lathe in 1969 by a young man who did not yet know how many mornings he would spend, decades later, still carrying it. The mystery of it sat in his pocket the way it always did, unremarked, unexplained, waiting on nothing but time. The coffee had gone lukewarm in the urn by the time he finished the floor, and outside, the gravel lot was filling with the second wave of cars, parents idling at the drop line, county lights still gray and unimpressed with the whole affair. Every morning that mattered to Harmon Brackett started the same way, and had for 6 years, long before anyone thought to put him on a payroll. He rose before the range's chain-link gate was unlocked by anyone else, drove the 11 miles from his house on Coy Road in a truck older than most of the shooters' parents, and let himself in through the side door with a key that was, unlike the one in his pocket, entirely legitimate. His coveralls were gray, the range's name stitched crooked above the left pocket by Ruth's hand 30 years before she died. A small imperfection he had never once had corrected, because correcting it would have meant admitting it needed fixing. He wore them the way a man wears a uniform he has stopped needing anyone to notice, which is to say correctly, without display. His right shoulder would not rise past the height of his own chest, hadn't for 11 years, since a fall off a ladder cleaning gutters that he described to exactly no one as anything more than clumsiness. He had built a whole grammar of movement around that shoulder without seeming to think about it. He turned his body, rather than reaching across it, angled toward whatever he needed the way another man might angle toward a conversation, so that the limitation read, to anyone who bothered to watch, less like a wound than like a preference. He swept the same way. He wiped down the bench rests the same way. He served the old Target carriages, when no one was looking, the same way, turning his whole frame square to the drum before his hand ever touched the key riding in his coverall pocket, the one machined in 1969, that fit no rifle built after 1975, and no equipment currently issued to the Mill Race Youth Marksmanship Program, and yet turned the drum on the oldest carriage in the building smoother than any tool the vendor catalogs listed. At home that evening, before supper, before anything else, he would walk out to the narrow bed of tomatoes and marigolds along the south side of the house and check the little brass gauge staked into the soil, the one Ruth had used for 41 years, to tell herself the ground was ready before she trusted it with seed. He wiped the dial with his thumb. He checked the needle against a reading he had long since memorized. The garden did not need the gauge anymore. Harmon watered by feel, same as he did everything else. But the gauge got checked, every evening, rain or dry, the way some men check a wallet photograph, and act with no audience and no argument to make. Kellen had lived with him for 8 months now, since his mother took a contract position overseas that paid enough to matter and left a hole in the house that a 17-year-old boy did not know what to do with. Harmon had never once made him talk about it. Instead, there was breakfast, always the same. Eggs and toast and a glass of milk Kellen was too old for and drank anyway because his grandfather poured it without asking, and a 15-minute drive to the range with the radio off because Harmon liked to hear whatever Kellen wanted to say, and Kellen, more mornings than not, wanted to say nothing at all. Just ride with his rifle case across his knees and watch the fields go by. Get your position built before you build your breath, Harmon told him most mornings. Some variation of it, plain and small, the kind of sentence you could carry in a coat pocket the way you'd carry a key. Kellen would nod like it was nothing, the way 17-year-olds nod at everything their grandfathers say, and neither of them would mention that his grandfather said it like a man repeating something he had once been paid and trusted to teach. By the time they pulled into the gravel lot, Harmon in coveralls and Kellen in a range polo one size too big, the boy would already be watching for Kira Havermeyer's white pickup, and the old man would already be reaching for his mop. Kira Havermeyer had been a good shot before she was ever anybody's instructor, and she proved it again that Tuesday morning in front of the whole assembled roster, coaching a qualifying drill that had nothing performative about it at all. A crosswind was gusting unevenly off the tree line, 8 to 14 miles an hour by her own flag reading, and she called windage corrections for 6 shooters in a row without missing, her voice level, her eye reading the range flags the way another woman might read a clock. Nobody in that hall could have called her unskilled. She had earned her collegiate rifle championship the hard way, and she coached like someone who remembered exactly what it cost. It was the 7th shooter, a slight, anxious boy named Preston, who unraveled her afternoon. He had gone stiff behind the rifle, his breathing shallow and audible even from the bench beside him, his group opening wider with every round instead of tightening the way a good coach's correction should have closed it. Kira called out a windage adjustment, sharp and confident, and Preston dialed it, and his next shot went wider still. Harmon was 3 benches down, restacking a crate of foam ear protection when he said something to the boy. Quiet, not meant to travel. Something about breathing out on the natural pause instead of holding it, about letting the wind finish its gust before breaking the shot, rather than fighting it mid-breath. It was the kind of sentence a man says without turning his head, the kind meant for one pair of ears only. Kira heard it anyway. She crossed the space between them without hurrying, which was somehow worse than hurrying would have been, and stood at the end of the bench with her laminated checklist held loose against her hip. "That's not how we teach breath control here," she said, pitched just loud enough for the row behind her to catch it. "Per program standard, we call the shot on the exhale full stop, not on some old hold and release method from the Stone Age. I don't know where you picked that up, but it's going to put him in the habit of chasing his shots instead of trusting his position." Preston looked between them, rifle still cradled, uncertain whether he had done something wrong by listening. "He was flinching on the hold," Harmon said. 3 words, no more, delivered the way he delivered most things, without heat, without appeal to any authority beyond the boy's own shaking hands. "He was flinching because he's nervous," Kira said, "which is a training issue, not a technique issue, and I'd appreciate it if maintenance stuck to the floors." She said it lightly, the way a person says something they intend as a small joke and not a wound, and a few of the older boys near the ammunition table laughed the easy laugh that costs nothing to give and everything to receive. Jared Tolliver, 24 years old and 1 year into the job of assistant range officer, stood by the scorer's table with the paper log open in front of him and said nothing at all, though his pen stopped moving for the length of that exchange, and something in the set of his mouth suggested he had heard the wind call line from across the hall and did not entirely disagree with the man in coveralls. He had watched Harmon service that same carriage system a dozen times after hours, watched him work a stuck feed mechanism loose with nothing but a rag and patience, and some private ledger he was keeping without knowing he'd started. One told him the arithmetic here didn't add up the way Kira's checklist said it should. Harmon didn't answer her. He picked the crate back up, angled his whole body toward it, the way he angled toward everything, and carried it to the supply closet without another word. The not quite limp in that motion, the only thing that suggested the exchange had cost him anything to swallow. Preston's next 3 shots, taken on his own breath and nobody's checklist, tightened into a group half the size of the one before it. Nobody remarked on it. Kira had already moved down the line to the 8th shooter, calling wind in a voice too confident to notice what had just happened 40 feet behind her. It got worse before the qualifying match, the way these things generally do, in small procedural steps that each looked reasonable enough on their own. Kira posted a laminated notice on the equipment locker on Thursday, in her own careful hand, stating that per program standard, only certified range staff were authorized to service the target carriage systems, effective immediately, and everyone understood without being told that the sign existed for an audience of 1. Harmon read it once, standing in front of the locker with his mop leaned against the wall, and said nothing, though Jared, watching from the scorer's table, noticed he did not walk away right off. He stood there long enough to run 2 fingers along the drum housing of the nearest carriage, the one with the siding rail that had been drifting for weeks, and something in the way he touched it, careful, proprietary, told Jared more than the sign ever could. "Where's uneven on the left bearing?" Harmon said finally, to no one in particular, or perhaps to Jared, who was the only one close enough to hear it. "Somebody's been running it off the rail instead of the drum. It'll seize inside a week if it's not reseated." Jared wrote it down, out of habit more than conviction. In the paper log Kira had been trying to get digitized and shipped off to a vendor for 8 months now, the same log that recorded, in faded ink going back 6 years, every hour Harmon had spent on that very carriage before the county ever cut him a paycheck for pushing a mop. The technicality came Friday morning, 2 days before qualifying, when Kira called Kellen aside near the sign-in table and told him, checklist in hand, that his enrollment paperwork listed his legal guardian as his mother, still overseas, and that per program standard a minor's roster slot required an on-file guardian signature updated within the last academic year, which his was not. She was sorry. She would be happy to reinstate him once the paperwork cleared, which, given the county mail schedule and his mother's time zone, might not happen before the following season. Kellen took it the way 17-year-olds take most unfairness, silently, jaw tight, rifle case gripped a little harder than it needed to be, and did not tell his grandfather until they were most of the way home, staring out the window instead of at the fields. Harmon didn't raise his voice. He didn't call anyone. He drove the rest of the way with both hands steady on the wheel and said only that paperwork problems had solutions and that he'd look into it in the plain, unhurried register he used for everything, though later that night, alone in the garage with the overhead bulb humming, he sat for a long while with a folder of old guardianship correspondence spread across his workbench, doing arithmetic on dates that had nothing to do with rifles at all. It was the following morning, back at the range, that he said the one thing that stuck with Jared longer than any argument would have. Kira was walking the sign-in table when she mentioned, breezily, to Priya, that the old carriage system was probably headed for salvage anyway once the board approved the new scoring contract. No sense fighting over what wouldn't exist. Come summer. Harmon, mopping nearby, did not look up. He said a single word, quiet, almost to himself, the way another man might clear his throat. "Receipt," he said. Nothing more. Not an argument, not a correction, not even clearly addressed to her. But Jared, standing close enough to hear it, felt something shift in the pit of his stomach that had nothing to do with equipment at all, the way you feel a held door about to give before it actually swings. The qualifying match ran hot and gusting from the first relay. The crosswind Kira had flagged all week finally arriving in earnest, 14 gusting to 22, flags snapping instead of drifting, and it was the number 3 carriage, the oldest one in the building, the one with the drum Harmon had warned about, that seized solid on the downrange end during the 4th relay. freezing a target mid-retrieval with 6 shooters still on the clock and a line judge already reaching for his whistle to call the match. Kira was 30 yards away calling wind for another lane and didn't see it happen. Jared did and went to the carriage himself and could not get the drum to turn. Harmon was there before anyone thought to call for him, moving faster than his coveralls, and his shoulder generally let him seem capable of, though what carried him wasn't speed so much as certainty, a man walking toward a problem he had solved 100 times before, under worse conditions than a Tuesday qualifying match. He knelt at the housing, turned his whole body square to it the way he always did, and from the coverall pocket came the small brass key that fit nothing else in the building. He seated it into a slot nobody else knew was there, filed decades ago to a tolerance no manufactured part could match, and turned it a quarter turn, then held, then a quarter turn again, the sequence unhurried and exact, each motion its own complete act before the next one started. The drum released with a sound like a held breath finally let go. The target swung back into position. 60 seconds, maybe less, and the line was live again. But it was Preston, back on the line for his final string, hands shaking worse than they had all week with the gust building instead of dying, who needed him more. Harmon crouched beside the bench, level with the boy's ear, and his voice dropped into a register nobody in that hall had heard from him before, flat and clipped and entirely without softness, the register of a man giving instruction that lives depend on. "Read the mirage off the berm, not the flag," he said. "Flag's lying to you. It's gusting behind a backstop. Hold for a full value 10, dial it, and brake on the lull, not the peak." Preston dialed it. Preston broke his shot on the lull. It went dead center. Colonel Weston Fairbanks, 61 years old, retired and silver-haired and standing at the back rail in the range officer emeritus role he had held for 2 seasons without much to do besides watch, had gone very still at the words "full value 10." The exact phrase catching him somewhere behind the sternum before his mind caught up with why. He was already walking down the line by the time Harmon straightened up from the bench, one hand still braced against the rail, an old man's price for kneeling on gravel. "Say your name," Fairbanks said, and it wasn't a request. Harmon looked at him the way he looked at everything, without hurry, and said it plain. Fairbanks's face did something none of the assembled teenagers had ever seen an adult's face do, a kind of structural failure held together by sheer will, and the word that came out of him next was not a greeting at all. "Instructor Brackett," he said, and stopped there, as if the 2 words had used up all the air in his chest at once. The board's Friday vote had been, until that Tuesday afternoon, a formality dressed up as due diligence, and Kira Havermeyer had built her whole calendar around it staying that way. The contract on the table would retire the analog carriage system entirely, replace it with a digital scoring vendor whose sales literature she could recite from memory, and the paperwork required, as its very first condition, a signed certification that the existing equipment was beyond economical repair. Colonel Fairbanks, standing in the middle of the range with his hand still resting on Harmon Brackett's shoulder, staring at a carriage that had just been fixed in under a minute with a key older than the boy who'd fired the winning shot, put that certification in more doubt than any inspection report ever could. She did not say any of that aloud. What she said, once the match wrapped and the teenagers had scattered toward the parking lot trading half-formed rumors about the old janitor and the colonel, was that she was thrilled Instructor Brackett had jumped in, that his hands-on knowledge was exactly the kind of institutional memory the program valued, and that she'd love to sit down with him properly once the board business settled. It was, Jared thought, watching her deliver it with the same even confidence she called wind with, the sound of a woman recalculating a deal in real time behind a smile that hadn't changed at all. By Wednesday morning, the certification of obsolescence paperwork that had been idling in a folder for 2 weeks was suddenly moving with real urgency, emailed to the Vendors Council, CEC'd to 2 board members who rarely answered anything inside of a week. Kira called it due diligence. Jared, reading the subject lines over her shoulder without meaning to, called it something else in his own head and didn't say it out loud. He went looking for the paper log that afternoon, meaning to add Tuesday's carriage failure and Harmon's repair to the record the way he'd been taught. 6 years of entries in 3 different hands, most of them Harmon's own careful block print. going back to a volunteer arrangement nobody currently on staff had negotiated or remembered. The supply closet shelf where it lived, third from the top, behind the ear protection crates, was empty. He checked the scorer's table, the filing drawer under the sign-in desk, the glove compartment of the range truck out of pure desperation. Nothing. 6 years of a man's unpaid labor, gone from where it had sat undisturbed for as long as Jared had worked there. The same week a colonel had said a name like, "It cost him something to say it." He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't have anything yet but a bad feeling and an empty shelf. And a bad feeling wasn't proof of the kind that stood up at a board meeting. Kellen, meanwhile, was carrying a different kind of empty. His roster slot hadn't been reinstated, guardianship paperwork or no, and watching Preston's winning shot from the sidelines instead of the firing line had done something to him that his grandfather's steady driving hadn't fixed on the way home. He told Harmon flatly, over a supper, neither of them finished, that maybe he was done with the program altogether, that there wasn't much point chasing a scholarship shot at a range that couldn't be bothered to fix a signature error in 8 months. He didn't say it to wound his grandfather. He said it the way a boy says the truest, angriest thing he has, which is often aimed nowhere at all and lands everywhere regardless. Harmon didn't argue with him. He cleared the plates, checked Ruth's gauge in the fading light same as always, and said only that quitting was a decision a man ought to make on a full night's sleep and not an empty stomach. And Kellen, too tired and too raw to hear the difference between that and permission, went to bed without answering. For the first time in 8 months, Harmon Brackett sat alone in his kitchen with a boy upstairs pulling away from him and a program's whole future tilting toward a vendor's contract, and no clear sense of who, besides an old colonel with a debt he hadn't yet explained, even believed there was anything here worth saving. Jared found the answer to the missing log 2 days later, and it wasn't in the supply closet at all. It was in his own truck, tucked behind the bench seat where he'd shoved a battered accordion folder back in the spring after a slow Sunday shift, the kind of tidying a person does and forgets within the week. He'd made carbon duplicates of the last several months of entries back then, purely because the original pages were curling at the edges, and he liked things squared away, a habit from his mother's filing cabinets more than any suspicion of anyone. He hadn't thought about that folder since April. He sat in the driver's seat with the duplicate pages spread across the wheel and read 6 years of Harmon Brackett's own block print, dated and initialed, drum reseatings and bearing replacements and sighting rail alignments logged in a volunteer's careful hand long before the county had ever put him on a payroll to push a mop. And there, 3 entries from the end, in a different pen and Kira's own handwriting, was a note dated the previous Friday, the day after the sign about certified staff went up on the locker, pulled original log per pending equipment review, filed with vendor documentation. She hadn't lost it. She'd taken it and logged the taking in the same careful hand she used for everything, apparently never imagining anyone else had already made a copy of the very thing she meant to remove. He brought the pages to Colonel Fairbanks first, not to Kira, some instinct telling him the colonel would know what to do with them better than a 24-year-old assistant range officer would, and Fairbanks read them standing in the gravel lot with the same stillness he'd shown on the firing line, turning each page over like it weighed more than paper should. When he looked up, he wasn't looking at Jared at all. He was looking toward the range hall, where Harmon was visible through the window, alone, resetting the number 3 carriage's bearing exactly the way the vanished log said he'd done it 11 times before. "You want to know why that name stopped me cold Tuesday?" Fairbanks said, and it wasn't a question so much as a decision he'd already made to answer it. 1971. I was a lieutenant, 22 years old, dumber than I had any right to be, and my recon team got pinned down 11 miles past where anybody planned on us being. Radio only, no visual, no air support coming for 6 hours. There was one voice on that net walking us out yard by yard, wind and terrain, and every bad decision I was about to make before I made it. 4 of us came home because of that voice. I've spent 40 years since then building programs like this one so that other people's grandsons get taught properly instead of guessing. And near as I can tell, ma'am. And here he did turn, finally, toward Kira, who had come out to the lot without either of them noticing, checklist still in hand. "You've spent 18 months trying to erase the paperwork on the only reason any of this exists at all." Kira didn't answer right away. Her eyes went to the pages in Fairbanks's hand, then past him to the window. to the old man in coveralls kneeling at a drum housing with a key that fit nothing built after 1975, and something in her face did the same structural work his had done on the firing line, though slower and with none of the joy. Colonel Fairbanks found Harmon still kneeling at the number 3 carriage, and he did not announce himself the way a man announces himself to someone he outranks. He crossed the range floor slowly, the accordion folder under one arm, and when he reached the carriage, he lowered himself, with some effort, to one knee beside the old man, so that for a moment 2 elderly men knelt together at a piece of scrap-value machinery, as though it were an altar. He set something on the bench beside Harmon's tool roll without a word. A compass, brass-cased, its glass scratched nearly opaque, the kind issued decades ago and rarely seen since, carried by the wear on its casing in a breast pocket for the better part of a lifetime. He did not explain it. He simply set it down and let it sit there, and waited to see if Harmon would ask, and Harmon did not, because Harmon already knew exactly what it was and exactly what carrying it that long had cost the man kneeling beside him. "I've had this since the morning after," Fairbanks finally said. "Never could bring myself to use it for anything but a paperweight. Didn't feel right. Using a compass, some other man's voice had to point for me." He turned it slightly with 2 fingers, not offering it, just letting Harmon see the old engraving on its underside had worn to nothing. "I looked for you for years. Record said discharged, nothing after. I figured you didn't want finding." "Didn't need finding," Harmon said. "Wasn't lost, just quiet." It was as close to an explanation as he offered anyone, and it was, for him, a great deal. He set the windage key down on the bench beside the compass, the 2 small worn objects sitting together in a way that made the whole history between them plainer than either man's face would. He told it the way he told everything, in small, true sentences, no more than 3 at a stretch. He'd trained men to read wind and ground and each other's breathing for 10 years because the Corps had asked him to and because he was good at it. And when it ended, he came home and buried it, not from shame, but because the men he'd taught had gone on to lives that didn't need an old instructor trailing behind, reminding them what they'd survived. He'd taken the janitor's job because Ruth's medical bills had eaten the pension thinner than either of them let on, and he'd kept the carriages running for 6 years before that, because a boy ought to have decent equipment to learn on, county budget or no, and it had never once occurred to him to ask anybody for money for fixing what he already considered his to fix. He never asked the county for a dime for fixing what was already his to fix. "I don't want a ceremony," he told Fairbanks, plain as anything. "I want the carriages left alone, and I want my grandson back on that roster before Friday. That's the whole of it." Fairbanks nodded slowly and did not argue, because there was nothing in that request left to argue with. Kellen learned the rest of it that night, alone, the way boys often learn the truest things about the people who raise them, by accident, and too late to say anything about it in the moment. He'd gone looking for a socket wrench in his grandfather's toolbox in the garage, hunting for something to fix his bike chain, and found instead, tucked beneath a false-bottom tray Harmon had built himself out of scrap plywood decades ago, a thin stack of carbon paper pages in his grandfather's own block print, dated back 6 years, entry after entry of drum reseatings and bearing work signed only with the initials HB, and never once billed to anyone. He sat on the cold garage floor for a long time with those pages in his lap, reading his grandfather's quiet, exact handwriting, describing labor nobody had asked him to do and nobody had paid him for. 6 years of Tuesday and Thursday evenings that Kellen had assumed, without ever really thinking about it, were just his grandfather being his grandfather. He thought about every morning ride to the range in near silence, every small sentence about breath and position offered like loose change, and understood, sitting there, that his grandfather had been quietly holding up an entire building's worth of history alone, expecting no one, least of all his own grandson, to ever need to know. The Millrace Youth Marksmanship Program's board met that Friday morning in the same folding chairs the shooters used on qualifying days, and Kira Havermeyer stood at the same whiteboard where she had once called Harmon Brackett the maintenance man, in front of a room of teenagers who laughed because she gave them permission to. She did not need Fairbanks to prompt her. She withdrew the vendor contract herself before the vote was even called, sliding the folder back across the table to the board chair without ceremony. and she read the corrected log into the record in a flat, careful voice. Every entry, every initial, 6 years of unpaid labor recited exactly as Harmon had written it, with no editorializing at all, because for once in her professional life, she seemed to understand that the numbers spoke plainly enough on their own. When she finished, she said only that the program's equipment review would be handled in-house going forward, and that Kellen Brackett's roster status should be corrected immediately, an administrative oversight, nothing more. She did not look at Harmon while she said it. She looked at the log itself, at the ink, the way a person looks at something they are only now understanding they never had the right to erase. Weeks passed the way weeks do, the gravel lots cycling through mud and dust and back to mud, and the range hall settled into a rhythm nobody remarked on out loud, though everyone in it had changed some small, specific way. Kira still ran her drills with the same sharp confidence, but she'd taken to prefacing her corrections differently now, less per program standard, more ask Instructor Brackett what he thinks, and she meant it. Jared kept the paper log himself by hand, no vendor, no app, and had started a second ledger of his own beside it without telling anyone why. The brass windage key hung now on a nail beside the range's newly restored analog scoreboard, retired from active service, but never far from Harmon's reach, a small fixed point in a room that had rearranged itself around him without his ever asking it to. And on a bright, ordinary Saturday morning, with the crosswind gentle for once, and the flags barely stirring, Harmon Brackett stood at the back of the hall in his gray coveralls, mop in hand, sweeping beneath that nail while his grandson settled onto the firing line for his qualifying round, unannounced, unhurried, exactly the way he had always done everything that mattered most. Some of the steadiest hands in any room belonged to the people nobody thought to ask.